Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Sketchy Ideas, the live point, counterpoint video podcast where we illustrate and debate concepts surrounding leadership, business, personal achievement in all the ways that might make you think twice before you implement that new idea you just saw on the internet. Hi, I'm Brad James.
And I'm Michael Rampola.
And today we are going to tell you whose job it is. But before we do that, let's hear a little bit from today's sponsors. Michael.
Sketchy Ideas is powered by Spirity. Spirity helps business owners overcome the obstacles that are holding them back from that next level of success that they've been striving for. Spirity helps you create a plan and the means to get there. So whether it's a lack of resources, lack of a focus, or a lack of a bridge to cross that gap in front of you, Spirity can help you create and discover the things that you need to achieve your next thing. Spirity.
And our second sponsor is Cream City Marketing. And if you're watching on that Facebook channel, you know we are here. So, Facebook, Cream City Marketing, we help small and medium-sized businesses implement marketing strategies that actually drive ROI. So if you need help implementing that strategy or those tactics that you've seen, read about, maybe you heard about here on this show, we can help you. Ping us in the Messenger, DM us on Instagram, email us, whatever you want, creamcitymarketing.com. You can go and find out more there. All right. So with that, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the difference of responsibility and accountability. So episode 31, here we go. All right. So Michael, you and I were talking a lot about this last week as we left last episode.
Yep.
And talked a lot about why there needs to be definitions around this. And maybe you've got a story that you heard of between now and last week that when you brought it up to me, that was a little different.
So Brad, you're absolutely right. From what we talked about last time was what makes a great leader great and how great leaders lead. And one of the key things is being clear on who's responsible and who's accountable. And in the course of my work, I was talking with another group about this exact same idea. The gentleman I was speaking with is in charge of commercial sales for this large company. He works in Lithuania, and he said, it's interesting. He said, I was talking about responsibility and accountability with my team, and I discovered that they don't have a word for accountability. And I said, okay, you're going to have to explain this to me more. He said, well, they have a word for it. It's just the exact same word as responsibility. So in Lithuanian, responsibility and accountability translate into the same word. They basically end up functioning as synonyms. But as anybody who's actually tried to differentiate who's responsible and who's accountable knows, they're not the same thing. And so this leader was discovering he was challenged because literally in his local geographic culture, there is no word for the thing he was trying to establish. Which, as I'm thinking about it, reminds me of a similar analogy, and I hadn't thought of this before now. There's not a word for entrepreneurship in some cultures. There's no word for person who starts their own business. And I think it says a lot about a culture that there's no word for the thing because it means that's not a part of their culture. So it's like the flip of there's 300 words for the joke, right? There's 300 words for snow in Eskimo because it's everywhere. We need to talk about all the different kinds of it. The flip of that is if there's no word for it, you've never built a mental construct for it, right? Brian, when we talk about language, right? When it comes to,
right,
I'm going to give you, this is my cue to talk brain science. If your brain doesn't have a word for it, you have no framework for it, it's not a thing for you. It doesn't exist.
Correct. Yeah. So when he's dealing with that, did he share with you at all as to how he was trying to demonstrate or explain it to them, or did they understand enough where it began to make sense?
From my understanding is he eventually got there, but it was just when he recognized the uphill battle he was facing, instead of just trying to say one or the other, he had to really step back and say, okay, what's the real roadblock in front of me? The real roadblock in front of me is not that I don't have a word for it. The fact that I don't have a word for it says that they don't understand this as a concept, I have to go back to concepts and principles,
Gotcha.
which is a framework, and which is what we talk about, right? So he had to go
Yeah.
back and say, well, what's the framework? How do I describe the difference? If there's a word for it, most people will be able to say, okay, it's this or it's that. But if there's no word for it, then I have to start from square one. And that's where he was at.
Okay. So, and that's kind of where we're starting from today, because you and I have both lived in organizations and businesses and partnerships where responsibility and accountability have been treated as exactly the same thing, even though there's clearly a difference between the two, right? So I looked up, while we're looking this up, I made some notes. Responsibility definition, right, is very different than accountability. So a responsibility, according to, this is Oxford Dictionary.
Yeah, they're pretty smart.
Yeah, right?
It's good source.
The state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or having control over someone. A true leader takes responsibility for their team and helps them achieve goals. But if we look at the difference in what accountability means, accountability is defined as the quality or state of being accountable, an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility for one's actions or results. So in this case, in my mind, there's definitely a difference in how they need to be used. And again, the reason we're defining them as such as within the show is because, and we've talked about this a lot, defining things helps human beings understand where they apply and how they work. So when we begin to look at accountability versus responsibility, they are two different sets of how your brain needs to think about a task, a goal, etc. Tell me if I'm wrong, right?
Yeah, you nailed it. And so I'm simplifying and summarizing from Mr. Oxford. Is it a Mr.? I don't know. From the Oxfords. And here's what I pulled out. Responsible is the duty to deal with. Accountable is I'm in charge of the results. Those are different. Deal with it.
Yes.
And the results of it. And I think that is the biggest. I love it. Thanks again to the Oxfords. They're nailing it because that is really the difference. That is really the difference and I'm going to put it in our terms, and our terms look like this. Duty to deal with is the process.
So it's the act,
whereas
right?
The act, process, action. Whereas in charge of results is just that, it's outcomes. Outcomes, I would even say goals, something like that. And those are two different things. I was just talking with somebody about delegation. And I know, Brad, you and I talked a lot about delegation, so this is maybe a tease forward, but I said, if you're delegating something, you can either dictate the process and not control the results, or you can dictate what the results need to be and let go of the process. But if you control both, you're not really delegating. You're just, you're still doing it. So who's responsible, who's accountable need to be two different people, because sometimes it's the same person. But the difference is they are two different functions. I'm responsible for and I'm accountable for. It's two different functions. And I think it's important. It's really important to differentiate between those two things.
So I'm curious if you're watching this show and if you're following along with us right now, if you've ever had a challenge like separating the two, or why, or if you've been in situations, chime in, tell us what those situations are. Because I'm really curious, because it really does depend on an organizational culture or belief systems and core values of the individuals who technically are accountable for the results, but they don't necessarily have the understanding of the difference between the two. So, and you've got a framework that we're going to go over, right? That's going to describe, hey, if I am in a place of leadership, this is one way to begin to define it for my team as well as for myself, in order to help you understand, measure effectiveness of those who are responsible versus those who are accountable, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And you know what? I'll tell you so it's a framework. So tie back to frameworks. And here's a good one. You can look this one up, but let me first tell you, whenever I introduce this framework to folks, typically they say, oh, I never heard of that. And I say, well, there was a time that I had to meet it also. And let me tell you when I found out about it. So I was working in a large organization. I was the talent consultant. So I'm supporting talent development for different parts of the organization. And we were always paired up with an HR business partner who was the HR generalist, employment law, that kind of stuff. So myself and my counterpart, taking care of this function, we both said we're in charge of coaching. And what we discovered, and that right there, so talk about definitions really matter. And we were stepping on each other's toes. And she said, well, I'll take charge of the coaching. I said, I thought I was in charge of the coaching. She said, well, it's always been part of my job. Well, I said, well, my leader is telling me that this is something I need to be focused on. And we were back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this. And fortunately, one of our two leaders said, here's a little tool you guys might want to take a look at together. Right. And that it wasn't just that. It ended up being a bunch of different things that we were not clear, at the very least, as to who was responsible and accountable. When it came to coaching, by the way, that was a second tier problem. Definitions matter. Where she said, I'm in charge of coaching, what she meant is I'm in charge of making sure that the leaders are doing their coaching and counseling conversations when it comes to performance management, i.e. people are screwing up and we need to document it. I knew that I was in charge of training people on our new coaching model, which hopefully was prevent the need for performance management. She had no problem letting me do that because she didn't want to. And I have no problem letting her manage performance management conversations because I've been there, done that, and that can be yours. Yeah. That can be yours. So we actually didn't want to do what the other one was doing. We just didn't understand that we were talking about two totally different things. Step one. Yep. Step two, we got into this model, which I'm about to introduce. I'll do the acronym first. The RASIC model, sometimes RASCI or RASCI or RASIC, whatever you want to call it, the RASIC model. The first two parts of it are responsible and accountable. And what you do with this model, I'll have to give you a quick visual on what it looks like. You actually take everything that you're doing in your organization. Here's a matrix, i.e. as a framework. You list out all the tasks, responsive tasks, things that need to get done, to-dos. And across the top, you put all the roles, all the different people that might be in charge of that thing. And you use these ideas here to basically map out who's responsible, who's accountable, etc., for each of these items. And by putting it in this matrix format, you verify that we're not stepping on each other's toes, there's no crossover, there's no duplication, and more importantly, we're not missing anything. So it does both of the things that you really want to do when you're trying to figure out whose job is it anyway. Right. Because what it lets you do is figure out, okay, am I in charge of this thing or am I just kind of on the periphery? And if I'm just on the periphery, who is in charge? So when there's a question, I know who to go to. So the beauty of this model is it answers all of these different questions that are typically assumed, but it makes them explicit. So it beats assumptions with explicit definitions. And any day you can do that, you're winning.
And for the record, this whole concept, if you look at like the history of project management software, it's all based on this idea and concept with some tweaks, right? Of layering technology over this basic concept. So Absolutely. If you're using project management software, this is something that if you haven't studied it or tried to even, at least just the nuts and bolts, the stuff that Michael's going to go over here, you're not probably fully leveraging the tools you have at your fingertips for responsibilities, accountabilities, and then judging how effective overall that is in achieving the organizational goals. Am I right on with that, or am I way off?
Right. Yeah, no, you're 100% right. This is baked into, and I'm sure there's a whole PMP chapter on this concept. Maybe there's one for each letter. I have no idea, but this is in there. If you're a little bit familiar with Agile and Scrum,
there is in my book, right? There's one word, one chapter, one word
per word, right? That would be quite. That's actually not a book. That's called encyclopedia. Because what this does. Oh, sorry. If you're familiar with Agile and Scrum, this is the terminology. There is, are you a chicken or a pig? Right. The same idea happens here. Which what your relationship to the work being done, the project, the goals, the outcomes, helps define how much involvement and who needs to do what. And at the end of the day, I think most of us just want to know, what do I need to do to be successful around here? And what do I not have to worry about? Right. And this model makes the implicit explicit and breaks all the assumptions down. And again, just tells you, makes it very, very clear and answers all of these other decisions at once. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. If you find that in your organization, under your purview, you're making the same decision over and over and over, it might be time to look into a framework like this. If you find that people on your team are either dropping the ball, because I didn't think that was my thing, or both trying to catch the same ball, like I'm picturing like volleyball. If two players keep running into each other trying to get the ball, or if we're both standing there watching it fall between us, or baseball, we were doing a who's on first reference earlier, right? If the balls keep falling in outfield because nobody's going after them, or if your outfielders keep running into each other, it might be time to explore a framework like this one that gets everything really, really clear.
That's because nobody's in right field because center field is filled. Why would anybody want to be in left field?
Very nice. Very nice. All right. That's good.
So before you dive into the why.
Headed look, by the way, he's going, I have no idea what you guys are talking about right now. Stage broadcasting.
Before we dive into the whole framework and the rest of it, I want everybody to understand that do an account of how effective your projects are in being accomplished on budget, on time, etc. And then dive into what have been the hiccups to getting those projects done consistently. Because if you really look at the effectiveness, there's all of these different project management like styles, how to run a project. There's waterfall, agile and Scrum are similar. There's Six Sigma. I mean, everybody has a different idea as to how to do it, but it's still all trying to solve the same problem. And it's still all based in this ideology of RASIC. And so you got to start looking at this stuff more, especially now when you're not in an office and we're going to continue to move towards working remotely, probably 40 to 60% of the week, rather than being in the office 80 to 100% during the week. And so understanding roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, and all this stuff, if you are a manager of a team, big or small, a leader of a company, big or small, it's good to understand these concepts and begin to implement them over time. I mean, I can tell you right now, like when we start having conversations about this in every company that I've been a part of, even if we don't implement the full structure, right? But we all understand the definitions and how this works, there's more clarity and seamlessness in getting work done than there was prior to having that conversation.
Ooh, clarity? Clarity and seamlessness. I'm in. Okay, so opposite of so if you like operating in the murky dark, and you like if you enjoy chaos, okay, VUCA. If you enjoy chaos and ambiguity, tune out now. Go, get out.
Yeah, go away.
Right. If you enjoy volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity, complexity and ambiguity. If you enjoy operating in chaos, the rest of our show is not for you.
No.
Public
Leave now.
service announcement. Leave now. Get out while you still can.
Go.
You're gone. We're done. Because like this next part's going to basically throw a wrench into your chaos. Can we do that? Can we
Sounds like an oxymoron. Sounds like an oxymoron.
There's a couple things we specialize in around here. I think that needs to go on the list.
Yeah, I think so.
Oxymorons. Not the wrenches in the chaos, the oxymorons part. Or at least part of it. Right, Brian? All right, so response. So let's get the quick terms. So we got responsible, accountable, we got good definitions. S, this is so responsible, accountable. S is supports. These are people, by the way. People are roles.
Mm-hmm.
I is informed,
and C is consultant. So take a given task or responsibility, a thing that needs to get done. And for each of them, you should be able to define which roles, and by the way, go by roles, not by people. Talk about that in a second. Which role is accountable to it, in charge of its results? Which role is responsible for it, has the duty to deal with it or do it? Who supports it? Who helps? Who is informed? All they need to know is what's happening. They're not in on the front end. They don't do the work. They just need to be made aware. And who's consultant? Consultant is they don't do the work, but they have some knowledge and you might tap them for expertise and insights. Supports has work to do or is a handoff in or out. Responsible is the doer, the ultimate doer, but accountable is in making sure that the responsible does it. If the responsible doesn't do it, accountable takes the heat. And that's an important distinction. So accountable makes sure responsible is doing it. If it's not doing, falls back to accountable. You might not need these other items. If all you have is a raw chart, you'll be okay. If you're a team of one, you are the raw chart. But if you think about from your roles instead of the people, you'll start to see how as a solo or an individual leader, or maybe I'm looking for a team one day, if you take your current I do everything, chief bottle washer, etc. type role, and you break it down into these different roles, then you can start to see how I might need somebody or a person to take over this column. This is how you upgrade. This is how you delegate to your future team without having the team yet in place. This is how you can load balance or at least identify there's an outsourceable function here. My thing as CFO, in my CFO hat, there's a lot in this column. And by the way, I suck at math and I hate numbers. Maybe I should bring in somebody or a piece of software, because a software can also kind of, in some cases, you got to set it up, but can cover some of these things too. Software can be supports. Anyway, this takes time to build, but I want to make sure you understand and hear that the roles and the functions and the things to be done, those are your the two top axes of your matrix. And it takes time to get into this and figure it out. And once you do, the doors it's going to open up and the insights it's going to provide to you are worth the time and effort it takes to make it.
Yes. Brian was outlining in the chat to me how all of these things. So I thought it was clever. So I figured I'd respond in kind.
It's a great example. It's a great example. Bring it in. It's here's a real example.
All right. So as you know, if you've been following us, we post a lot of content. All right. So Brian is responsible, our producer, the voice of God himself, is responsible for most of our social media presence. He's responsible and accountable for it. And then he responded with, both Michael and I are informed and only sometimes consulted. And I replied with, but you always have my support. So.
Perfect. That's a perfect little example. You're absolutely right. He's responsible and accountable, meaning he's in charge of results and he's in charge of doing the work, because basically we've completely outsourced or delegated that entire function to him. But in some cases he wants some input and he needs our help. But for the most part, he's the one doing the job.
Mostly he likes to make me look like a fool, I think. I think he gets some enjoyment out of that as he nods in response, yes.
I looked into our, it's funny you say that. I looked into our Giphy album yesterday.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, we're both equally ridiculous in GIF form.
So if you want to find our Giphy, just search Giphy for Sketchy Ideas, all one word. It'll show up. Brian put some great clips out there. And
nice job.
Yeah, you can even find it on Instagram if you're posting stories. So, go for it. Have fun. Have fun with it. Just tag us so we can reshare it. That's all I ask.
Yeah. I think highly gifable is a compliment these days, right? Like that's in social media cred, like that's a good thing.
I don't know. I'm not hip with the kids these days necessarily.
All right. So
all right. Hey, we've got a little bit of time. back to the
Okay.
framework. That was our tangent for the day. All right. So if you were following what Michael was saying, and we use that example, we talk about responsible, accountable, support, informed, and consulted. Now, what I would recommend you do is don't do this for your entire business right now if this is the first time you're doing this, okay? Take it and pick one segment that you are working on with a team or by yourself and outline the stuff very specifically and clearly for yourself. This is one of those things, and we might at some point talk about delegation and some of the frameworks that I use to coach a lot of entrepreneurs and startups when it's a solopreneur or a small team and they're beginning to add some admin support or support people into their company on how to delegate. But the challenge always with beginning to delegate and adding on staff, the reason this is so important is when you start scaling by adding people, you need to have some clarity on this premise. If you don't understand RASIC, or at least the basic bare bones of it, right? Like there's responsibilities, there's accountability, there's support, there's information, and there's consultation. When you look at it from that standpoint, based on your day-to-day, you will begin to see where you spend your time. And then you can tie it to your quarterly goals to go, is this really where I should be spending my time? And now you can begin to have those microeconomic opportunity cost discussions with yourself or your team in order to find the right people to take on certain responsibilities that you will still be accountable for. Because at the end of the day, if you're running a business or you're running an organization of any sort, there are goals and metrics, most likely, that you're trying to achieve. So I think that this is a really important concept, and I think if you're struggling with this a little bit, hit us up, drop comments in here. We're going to get back to you. And the biggest thing is keep in mind, right? We've got one of the best in the biz working on this regularly with businesses, and his name is Mr. Michael Rampolla, and he's more than happy to help you implement stuff like this, because it does help to have somebody from the outside looking in to be able to help you add clarity to what are responsibilities, what are those tasks. Do I have the process in place to break it down? Do I have the people and the roles defined so that I can begin to delegate responsibility and eventually delegate accountability so that you can focus on the next level of accountability, which is then you're leveling up your organization and your business. And if you're not, if you're struggling with this, again, don't just go dive into all of the information on the internet, okay? I promise you will get lost. I've done it. And you go down the rabbit hole, you find all this stuff, and I've witnessed people doing it. I've observed startups doing it. I've observed leaders doing it. It doesn't work. Like this specific tactic, the reason that I wanted Michael to talk about this is because it's so important, and it's still something that I struggle with regularly. And it's still something that I see like Fortune 500 CEOs who I've met and talked to about this stuff, they struggle with it. Like this is a skill all in its own. And if you can begin to work towards, I don't know if there's, Michael's pretty close to a master on this and an expert in the field, but I know that even Michael has shared with me stories about this, especially like when he just told you about the Lithuanian story, right? How do you define this stuff in other cultures, or when you're still going to navigate and have to tweak this to fit. And that's what Michael does, which is why I said he's a master of it. But I know he knows there are places where when dealing with cultural boundaries, that was a new thing when you brought that up last week. Yeah. Like that was a whole, you're like, this works until I hit this barrier. And then I had to navigate, instead of going over the hurdle, I had to dig a hole and go under, right?
Basically, yeah, exactly.
So again, use it, look it up. If you've got comments, questions, anything, you can always email us, info@sketchyideasshow.com, message us, Facebook, DMs, whatever, and if you really like this show today, share it with friends, drop comments in there. Hey, find us on your favorite podcast syndicate, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is, you can go find us. We'll be there. And then if you've got questions, ping us up, all right? Oh, sorry. Brian's working on the Apple stuff. So we're not on Apple Podcasts yet. That's to be soon. Sorry, Brian.
That would be, he's not responsible. I don't think he's responsible for that one. Speaking of which, that's, yeah, we'll work on it.
Fair enough.
Listen, folks, Brad,
We'll
thank you for the kind words. And you're absolutely right. This is not, I just have to, I once had a manager tell me, don't try to boil the ocean. And if you try to take on too much of this framework at once, that's exactly what you're trying to do. So one thing at a time, take it slow, build up a practice and build up some muscles around this. And absolutely, the first time for sure, get some outside help, because I know I needed it. And now, having done this countless times, outside perspective makes this work and enables it to have true value for you and your business. So to your growth, there you go. We want to say thank you to, again, to our sponsors. Thank you, Cream City Marketing. Thank you, Spirity. We appreciate your support. And remember, just because it's a sketchy idea doesn't mean it's not worth exploring. We will see you again next time. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.